Let's do this. Hey everybody, welcome back to Fantasy Inc. My name is Wyeth, and today we're talking about Mother of Learning, written by Domagoj Krmajic, aka Nobody 103. I really enjoyed this book series. It definitely took an interesting spin on the time loop aspect of writing. As always, I listened to the book. I'm an audiobook listener due to my visual impairment. That's how I get all my books, and the narrator, Jack Veraces, was fantastic. That's the good stuff. Now to get into the summary of the book. Our main character, Zorian, is a 15-year-old young man who comes from a merchant family. He is, to all extents and purposes, kind of a selfish young guy. He does not really care for his family in the slightest, having problems with his older brother Damon and his parents. The one member of his family he tolerates is his sister, and that's to a very limited extent. The book starts out with his first day taking the trip back to his magic academy for his third year. He's going just to regular classes, almost like a college feel to it, where he's learning from different schools of magic. He gets a mentor he very much doesn't care for, and for the first month of school, he's basically grumbling through it, really kind of grudgingly trying to extend his education so he can get a good grasp on it and disown his family. I would highly recommend Emancipation for the young man, but he's got bills to pay, so he kind of needs his family. Not to get too much further into the details, the story is a time loop story, similar to the movie Groundhog's Day if you've seen it, but instead of a day repeating, it is the month repeating. And at the end of the month, there is a large event that Zorian is now tasked with, morally or through other means, to keep from happening. He has some suspected knowledge of who may also be in this time loop, but he has to play his cards right, seeing as there's a lot of different pieces going on, and it's pretty dangerous for him if he were to outright just tell everybody that he's stuck in this time loop. Some different notes about this story is there is a lot of repetition. That may be pretty obvious seeing as it's a time loop story, but that is something to keep in mind when you're reading the first book. The fantastic thing that Nobody 103 did with this series was the fact that Zorian's a pretty smart young man and is able to change his interactions enough to keep things interesting. So the same scene is not repeating, it's being advanced upon. This way, you're able to see how Zorian's mind works. He's a very smart young man, like I said, and he's able to maneuver himself into less dangerous situations sometimes, while going the other route of the spectrum and going into those dangerous situations but becoming extremely prepared. I will, not getting into details, say his mentors are fantastic. You'll see that the Arania are able to teach him a different way of viewing his mind magic, as well as his other mentors are able to teach him about different facets and styles of magic, which is going to broaden his horizons. This book is called Mother of Learning for a reason, because Zorian diligently takes the time, no time off, and learns different aspects about how he can stop this event at the end of the month. Another thing I'll mention is the magic system itself. It's nothing too outlandish or new. It's very similar to just regular old high fantasy where Zorian's basically a wizard or a magician, but the level of detail put into the intricacies of the different magic schools he goes down is very well done, and I tip my hat to Nobody 103. I will mention that this began as a web serial. You can see at the beginning where Nobody 103 is figuring the story out just as we're listening to it. As the series progresses to Arc 2, Arc 3, and even Arc 4, he's definitely advancing his writing, and the book series is only getting better. I do recommend this for those people who are out there looking for a different scope on what can be done with time travel, because it's not a big facet in fantasy from what I've seen, and this is a great first book to start on that topic. We're going to go to the deep dive into the series right now, so if you haven't finished Mother of Learning, all 4 arcs, feel free to click off this video. But be sure to come back if you've checked it out and read through. I'm going to be discussing some deeper topics into the series, some specifics, and we'll get to have a conversation about it in the comments to see what you thought about the series. So I look forward to y'all joining me back for the second part, and keep reading. All in all, I thought that this series did the time loop trope very well. Looking back on it, now it's been about a week since I've read it, so forgive me if I've forgotten some of the main details. I thought the ending really came together, other than a few certain parts which I wasn't a fan of, but at the same time, still very glad that I read it. Now, let's talk about Zorian's character progression, because thank God he really needed some. Nobody 103 did a fantastic job of taking a incredibly selfish young man and giving him some much needed perspective. Now, at the same time, he didn't go too far with it. As we saw at the end of the series, he still had some grievances with his family, which I thought that were just ingrained into his personality, and I'm very happy that those grievances did not just disappear. The worst thing you can do about character progression is just inventing a new character in the first place. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the ending. My biggest grievance with the book as a whole was Red Robe's character reveal. To be quite candid with you, I cannot remember the real name of Red Robe, even though at the middle of book 4 it was revealed. That goes to my poor memory, as well as I don't think the character they went with, which was the lawyer who they interrogated at book 2, I believe, was a memorable pick. Now, it did make sense. If you look back at the time loop, after Red Robe had left it, his initial person, if you can think about it like that, had no recollection of the events that transpired. This went further than their current theory of them just exiting the time loop, like what happened with the first tribe of Arania that Zorian had met. It did give him the hint he needed to figure out who Red Robe was at the end, so it all very cleanly lined up, but at the same time, I really was hoping that it would be, someone more notable to the story, whether it was actually Zack, if he could have figured that out. I would have appreciated that. It could have been Zim. Alanik obviously was too far removed from things. Silver Lake, fantastic choice with the betrayal aspect of it, so it could not have been Red Robe. But there were some other areas that I feel like Red Robe's reveal could have been influenced by, whether it's a change of character or they gave more time to the gentleman who played Red Robe. I digress. Let's jump into the characters. I'm going to start with Zack for obvious reasons. His character, even though he had lived multiple decades in the time loop, still not being mature, was an interesting choice, but at the same time, I feel like a good choice for Zorian's character, who is sometimes overly mature. He was able to take the character of Zorian to actually have some fun on some occasions, which was definitely needed since Zorian is obviously cannot waste any time. This was a good dynamic between the two during dialogue and was able to flush out their choices. Now, when we see the chapter at the end of the book, I Win Part 1, we're able to determine Zack's motives going forward and why he kept the things he did secret. The choice to give Zack some things he could not speak about, aka his deal with the angels, it tempted the audience into suspecting him while also giving Zack an ulterior motive. Even though his character would not betray Zorian and was willing to die for him, it did add a nice element which I really appreciated. If I'm looking back, my favorite mentor was Zvim, due to the fact that he was a steady rock throughout the series. Obviously, in book 1, he's tearing down the pompous Zorian, who thinks he's mastered his first 3, which was not the case, as we then saw. These techniques was able to bring Zvim to believe Zorian's story because they were his own. This detail that Nobody 103 wrote into the series did not go unnoticed for me. Having to convince each character, but in a different way, about the time loop's existence was actually really interesting. Whereas Alanik was convinced by Zorian taking details, things he should not have known about all the nefarious organizations around and their activities, he was able to convince him. Zvim, on the other hand, needed to see proof of his own teaching methods. Big fan of this, and Zorian was able to determine which is the best way to convince everyone until you see the 4th arc, where he's then gotten it down. One of the big elements of this story, obviously, is the Aranea. I did have a bit of a problem in book 1 and 2 with how much time he spent with the different colonies. As I mentioned in the summary of this video, yes, there is a lot of repetition that Nobody 103 is able to add new elements to, though the Aranea arcs, as interesting as they were, did almost drag me out of the story. I want to get y'all's opinions on that. Maybe the Aranea was y'all's favorite part, but just kind of grogging through the actual experience with every single colony, I almost wanted to skip at certain times of the book. So I'd be curious to see what y'all think about that. Now let's go ahead and jump into the theme that was most notable to me, which is family. Zorian's relationship with his family obviously is strained, and it's interesting to see who he decides to bring into his circle and who he keeps out. Obviously, there's Kiriel, his sister, who he brings on in and becomes much more of a loving brother. And then I would say Damon is next on the list, where he doesn't exactly have a good relationship with him, but they come to an understanding throughout the final arcs, through Damon's different incarnations. Zorian no longer hates his brother in this instance, but is able to come to a respect for him now that he almost views them as equals. This is to Damon's detriment at the end when he's talking to the family, whereas you see Zorian's relationship between his parents and Fortov, his second oldest brother. He just doesn't care about him, in all honesty. And I'm happy that Nobody 103 did that. Zorian was stuck in this time loop for 8 years, and he didn't need to really build a relationship with either of them. You see that he never brought Fortov into the loop as well as his parents, even though he was able to understand his parents a little bit. He's still a little bitter about how they've treated him throughout his life, and he's not just going to give that up. That goes back to what I was mentioning earlier about character growth opposed to just changing the character as a whole. I really appreciate Damagoy taking that route because it seems much more realistic to me. My favorite magic part, jumping into that, is the simulacrum that Zorian is able to obtain and almost control once he meets and understands the Hydra. The simulacrum's choices are completely understandable once you conceive the realization that they could be there for the next 5 minutes or the next 5 hours. The fact that they argue with the main Zorian as equals, because to all intents and purposes they have all of his knowledge. The ability to control them but not have autonomy over them was a wonderful decision. Now, to get out of the time loop, the rules and regulations I completely understand, and though at the beginning I was not a fan of almost this treasure hunt that they had to go on, I slowly began to come around. Whether it was the actual powers that the objects provided, like the dimensional pocket housing a dimensional realm, or the dagger's ability to inflict different damage, or if it was even the extent that they had to go to obtain these items, I was then brought in and kind of got behind the treasure hunt as a whole. When all was on the line, the fact that Zorian was able to give these objects up to the dragon that they are fighting at the end, it goes to show you that he has grown, whereas old Zorian would have done whatever he could to keep these items to himself. The goal is to defeat the primordial being, which became very evident at the lengths he had to go to do so. As I mentioned earlier, the fake reality he placed Red Robe and Zack in to save his friend, as well as see all the dead man switches Red Robe left, was incredibly well thought out, which is Zorian's main thing. He thinks out every single possible conclusion that anyone could come to. He's an overthinker, and it's gone to be a talent opposed to a con, which it was at the beginning of the book. He's viewing things through a different lens. That's what I'm looking for in series like this, or just series as a whole, is having those character arcs come full circle. It goes back to the hero's journey, which all novels should revolve around, but sometimes it just falls flat. You need to make sure that not only the main character goes through the hero's journey, but the peripheral characters also have their arcs around it, whether they're hero or not. They need to almost end up where they began. Now, we're in a time loop book, so that's almost evident that it's going to happen that way when you get to the end of things, but just making sure that the details are there is what's really, really appreciated. All in all, I really enjoyed the series. I'm probably going to go back and read it in the future, but give me, about 1 or 2 years to kind of forget a few things, obviously. I really want to hear what y'all's opinions on it were. Feel free to jump in the comments and let me know. Other than that, I really appreciate all y'all's time, and be sure to keep reading.